Hi everyone, it is me, Cletus, and I hope life is treating you fairly well in the spring of 2026. Springing into action, this video explores the Korean War and why it remains unfinished more than 70 years later. Understanding this conflict helps explain the tensions that still exist on the Korean peninsula today and why two nations remain divided by one of the most heavily fortified borders in the world. I'm breaking this down into 6 steps to make it easier to follow. We'll start with part 1, where we look at the scars of conflict and the remnants this war left behind. To visualize the remnants of war, we begin with this haunting image of barbed wire, a stark reminder of the divisions that still scar the Korean peninsula today. Here we see the ghostly remains of artillery, abandoned and rusted in fields where fierce battles once raged. These weathered documents and pen represent the countless treaties, letters, and desperate communications that failed to prevent the coming catastrophe. Concrete tank traps emerge from the mist like tombstones, marking where armies clashed in brutal combat across the Korean landscape. This warning sign tells the story that continues today. Decades after the guns fell silent, Korea remains a land divided by danger, where the war technically never ended. We've seen the lasting remnants of war that still mark the Korean peninsula today. Let's go to the next step, which is to understand the post-World War II division of Korea that set the stage for this conflict. To understand the post-World War II division of Korea, we begin with this stylized map showing the Korean peninsula and its neighboring regions, where Korea's fate would soon be determined by foreign powers. Here we see the end of Japanese colonial rule, as soldiers witness the lowering of the Japanese flag, marking the conclusion of 35 years of occupation. This museum exhibit clearly shows how Korea was divided at the 38th parallel, creating the US zone in the south and the Soviet zone in the north, a temporary arrangement that would become permanent. On June 25, 1950, North Korean forces launched a massive invasion southward. The communist regime's ultimate goal was clear: unify the entire peninsula under their control. Soviet-supplied tanks and artillery rolled across the 38th parallel, catching South Korean forces completely off guard. The well-equipped Northern Army advanced rapidly through the mountainous terrain. In a matter of days, the temporary post-war division became a battleground. The arbitrary line that had split Korea was now being redrawn by force. Any hope for peaceful reunification was crushed as diplomatic solutions gave way to the brutal reality of war. The North Korean invasion has pushed deep into the south, threatening to unify the peninsula under communist rule. Next, let's go to part 3, which is to examine how this regional conflict escalated into a global proxy war with the UN intervention. To understand the UN intervention, we see the Security Council delegates voting to authorize military action in Korea. This chart reveals the reality of the UN coalition. The United States dominated with 90% of the forces, while 16 other nations contributed the remaining 10%. Here we see Chinese forces entering the conflict, their massive numbers turning what seemed like a UN victory into a completely different war. Meanwhile, Soviet factories worked around the clock, producing the weapons and equipment that would fuel this escalating conflict. Watch how the war transforms from a regional conflict into a massive proxy battle between the world's superpowers, with Korea as the devastating battleground. The global powers had now entered the conflict, transforming Korea into a battleground where East met West. Next, let's go to part 4, which is to detail the ground and air combat that defined the brutal stalemate. To detail the ground and air combat, we see soldiers enduring the brutal Korean winter, trapped in frozen trenches where survival became as much an enemy as the opposing forces. The skies above Korea became a deadly arena as Soviet-supplied MiG-15 fighters dominated the early air war with their superior speed and maneuverability. American F-86 Sabres soon arrived to challenge the MiGs, turning the Korean mountains into the backdrop for the world's first major jet-versus-jet combat. These aerial duels often ended in devastating ground strikes, where precision bombing campaigns left entire regions scarred by fire and destruction. Ground forces advanced under the constant threat of air attack, with infantry columns moving beneath fighter formations that could shift the tide of battle in moments. The peninsula itself became a canvas of war, forever marked by the intense ground and air combat that would define this brutal stalemate. We have seen the ferocious intensity of combat that defined the Korean War's military stalemate. Next, let's go to part 5, which is to examine the devastating human toll this conflict inflicted on the Korean people. To illustrate the human cost of this conflict, we see one of the war's most tragic consequences: the countless orphaned children left behind. This chart reveals the staggering reality that civilian deaths far exceeded military casualties across all nations involved, showing how this war devastated entire populations. Here at the UN Memorial Cemetery in Korea, we're reminded of the international sacrifice, where soldiers showing how this war devastated entire populations. Here at the UN Memorial Cemetery in Korea, we're reminded of the international sacrifice, where soldiers from 16 nations rest in these carefully maintained grounds. Here we see the human tragedy unfold. Families forced to flee their homes, carrying what little they could salvage from villages torn apart by war. Endless streams of displaced people trudged through harsh winter conditions, creating one of the largest refugee crises in modern history. The refugee crisis laid bare the immense human cost of this conflict, with millions displaced and families torn apart by the war. Next, let's go to step 6, which is to examine how the fighting finally came to a halt with the signing of the ceasefire agreement. To show the ceasefire negotiations, we see military commanders from both sides gathering to sign the armistice documents that would end active hostilities. Even as negotiations proceeded, fierce combat continued on the front lines, with soldiers enduring brutal winter conditions and intense firefights. Here we witness the historic moment when the Korean Armistice Agreement was formally signed, establishing a ceasefire, but notably not a peace treaty. Here we see the stark reality of division. Military watchtowers rising behind razor wire, symbolizing the permanent state of vigilance that defines this border. Notice how even the barbed wire becomes a canvas for memory, with memorial ribbons creating an arch of remembrance for those forever separated. This fortress-like fence stretches endlessly beneath stormy skies, representing not just a physical barrier, but the emotional and political storm that continues to rage across this divided peninsula. We've covered the armistice and the border that still stands today. That wraps up our look at the Korean War and why it remains unfinished. Hope this helped you understand this complex piece of history. Please be kind to one another. If you found this video educational and informative, please subscribe and share to spread the word. Feel free to leave a kind comment. Thanks for the privilege of your time. I am Cletus, and I won't shirk the truth. See you soon in my next video.